Welcome to the Confidence Through Health podcast. My name is Jerry Snyder. As a health, wellness, and sports performance coach, my goal each week is to bring you experts to help you take control of your health and build your self-confidence. Thanks for including me today on your journey to better health. I want to say thank you to Social Media Cowboys for sponsoring this week's episode of the Confidence Through Health podcast. If you need help with a website, if you need social media needs for your business, if you need help with AdWords, SEO, all those things that you know you should be doing, but you are too busy to do or you're too confused about, they are the experts that you need in your corner. If you're interested in launching a podcast, such as mine, they help me edit my podcast and do a fantastic job making sure that all of the technical side of it is handled and we launch a nice, neat, edited podcast episode each week. So I want to thank Social Media Cowboys for their continued sponsorship of the Confidence Through Health podcast. You can find them at socialmediacowboys.com, or you can find them as well with other sponsors at confidencethroughhealth.com. So Alicia, thank you for being a guest on the Confidence Through Health podcast.
Happy to be here. Nice to meet you.
So one of the things I like to bring to people is obviously health-related things, but obviously nutrition is a huge piece of that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much noise in the nutrition world and nutrition space. And what y'all are doing at Queen Street Bakery is what some people might say is like, okay, this is just more noise. This is just more like, is this true? Is this needed? But if you really understand how the body works and what we're looking for from a nutrient base, it actually is something that's very important with the gluten-free products that y'all are producing, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point because I think the whole idea of gluten-free has this very kind of like people think that gluten-free automatically means healthy, but unfortunately that's usually not true just because it doesn't have gluten. That gluten and the wheat and all of that that is in your typical bread products is replaced by other flours to try and kind of replicate the taste and the texture to the best of ability, but usually those ingredients are actually less nutrient dense.
Right. Uh-oh.
But it doesn't necessarily make it more nutritious, where that's something that we do differently for sure. Is our primary goal is to make bread out of ingredients. We always say kind of like ingredients your doctor or your dietitian would be telling you to eat more of, like beans and seeds, all of those foods that you're always told are packed full of nutrition, and they definitely are full of fiber, micronutrients, higher quality carbohydrates, all of that good stuff, instead of just being like, there to replicate the taste and texture with no real nutrition. It's
Right.
a bread product that's really packed full of nutrition, not just to, because I say like it's not just that it's free from gluten, but it's also got all of this great nutrition baked right into it as well.
Right. Well, and so my first thought, like automatically when you're describing that, is like, growing up in the 80s, we didn't know any different, right? Parents didn't know a whole lot, and so it was like you bought the brand that you trusted because the brand spent money on marketing,
Mm-hmm.
or it was what you were, your grandparents were feeding your parents and that kind of thing. And I just remember eating, white bread sandwiches, and just like now I wouldn't touch like the
Mm-hmm.
standard white bread because I know it's just basically sugar and processed ingredients,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And so looking at something and going, okay, I can still have that bread that reminds me of, you know, growing up in sandwiches and maybe going to your grandparents' house or something like that that has that sentimental value, but also like, okay, I can still get a quality ingredient, quality product that's not going to disrupt my gut or cause problems down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny to kind of reflect on childhood. And I even think about that too. I'm like, some of those things, I don't think I would be buying that for my household in the future, right? As we continue to learn and grow and learn more about what's better for our bodies, for sure. And there's a lot more variety and choice out there, which I
Yeah.
think for a lot of people, like you mentioned earlier, there's all this kind of nutrition noise around, like you go on social media and you're being told like a million different things every day. So
Right.
how do you actually know? It's kind of the same thing. You go into the grocery store and it's wonderful to see all the different types of products out there, but sometimes it can get really overwhelming because it's hard to know, especially when it comes to taste, right? Because
Yeah.
that kind of is, at the end of the day, super important. There's always going to be a group of people who just care about the ingredients and the nutrition of the food and they don't really care about how it tastes. But to most people, we want to be eating something that tastes good, like you said, has
Right.
that sentimental value of like, oh, that white bread sandwich from your childhood. But as an adult now, I also want it to keep me fuller for longer. I don't want to have like processed peanut butter on a piece of processed white bread and then at 30 minutes later it's like I never ate, right? So
Yeah.
we've learned all these things about how to kind of build a better meal for our bodies, and um, the having that kind of like that good taste paired with that good nutrition is the hardest part, but when you can crack it, I think it's really the kind of the gold star there.
Yeah. So how difficult is it to find those quality ingredients, right? To find the different types of flours, the different types of things that you're using to make sure that like, okay, I can trust this is actually what they say it is.
For sure. That's a very good question. I think that when it comes to quality, there's so many different factors at play there, right? We obviously want to be picking ingredients that we trust and that we know, from suppliers that we trust and that we know, but also it needs to be an ingredient that is high nutrition quality and has good
Right.
functionality too, because you could make a bread out of a great ingredient, but it could be like really flat, and that's not really the texture that you're looking for in a bread. So it needs to balance the taste and that functionality and also the nutrition as well. So I think that's where the hard part really comes in, is trying to balance all those different things, and
Mhm.
especially with gluten-free products too, like ours, because you don't want to have a bread that tastes like just quinoa, for example, right? You need
Right.
to find that kind of blend of ingredients that provides that good nutrition, but also a well balanced taste that gives you that nostalgic kind of taste and feeling. And a lot, another part of kind of the challenge there is the sourcing of the ingredients, because
Mhm.
we like crops vary, supply chains shift, the prices of the ingredients fluctuate. We saw that with like olive oil, for example. I believe it was last year the prices surged super high because of environmental factors in the
Right.
areas of the world that grow most of the olives and produce most of the olive oil, which causes the prices to rise. But for a brand like us, having using olive oil in our products is kind of more important regardless of cost, instead of switching to some less nutritious version of that
Yeah.
ingredient. So that's kind of another factor in there too, where I've seen this with other brands as well, especially when it comes to the gluten-free products as well, because you need to have those trusted suppliers, because we our products are gluten-free. They need to
Mhm.
be gluten-free, where that's never going to change. I've
Yep.
seen other brands who have had to make changes to their product, making it no longer gluten free because, for example, they couldn't supply certified gluten free oats in the quantities that they needed to be able to make their products. So there's all these kind of things
Yeah.
happening behind the scenes, but our core values at Weed Street Bakery will always be to make the most nutritious product that we can and make sure that it is allergen free. So we don't compromise on things like that, but it can definitely be a challenge when things happen all over the world that can cause
Right.
ripple effects that customers don't necessarily even know, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, and for people that don't know, like gluten is a binder, correct? Like so it's going to
hmm
bind those things. So if you take that out, like
hmm
you've got a like you've there's a difficulty there in like how do I make this stick together and look like bread?
Yeah, exactly.
and
Exactly.
and then also act like bread, right? Because it's not just we don't all just make sandwiches. It's grilled cheese, it's toast, it's all these
Hmm.
other things. And so like
Hmm.
you make something and it's like, okay, perfect. That works for this scenario, but then you've got to also make sure it works for the others because the last thing anybody wants is, to use it to make toast and then it just crumbles.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a common problem in the gluten-free bread world.
Yeah.
One thing that we focus on to kind of solve that problem is in those ingredients that we choose, we one of our favorite ingredients to use is chia seeds, for example,
Mhm.
which I'm sure, as you know, they absorb a ton of water and they kind of
Right.
create a little bit of a gel, and that makes the product really like moist and a little bit more kind of stretchy compared to if you're just making something out of rice flour. You get that common trope in the gluten-free bread world that it tastes like cardboard or sawdust,
Mhm.
whatever. But
Yeah.
we carefully select our ingredients so that, again, not only do they provide good nutrition because chia seeds are super, super nutrient dense,
Mhm.
but also they have that like functional property that also just makes a better bread. And sometimes we are always like shocked. Why don't more people do this? Right? Like
Yeah.
it solves both of those problems, but
Right.
we're happy to be the ones doing it.
Right. Well, and a lot of people consider chia seeds as like a quote superfood, right? Which
Hmm.
which again is one of those words that causes noise in the nutrition space.
Hmm.
But but it is like it because of the quality of the nutrition, it becomes something that when you add it in, it just adds so much more nutrients to the product.
Yeah.
So you can, in a way, you can eat less because you're getting more nutrients through
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
product, as opposed to if you eat white bread, you're basically saying, I'm just eating calories and there's not a whole lot else to it.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you've got to
Right.
go search for those nutrients somewhere else. And so it causes that overeating effect. Like you said,
Hmm.
I eat something and 30 minutes later, I'm hungry again.
Exactly. Right. Whereas if you choose to swap that bread in this example, that white bread for a bread like ours that's high in fiber, has some protein in there and lots of other nutrients as well. You're kind of like you're eating the same thing. You may be eating a similar amount of calories, but those calories are doing so much more for you. You're getting way more bang for your buck for the satiety that you're experiencing. Like you're going to feel fuller for longer without feeling super weighed down. So I think that's definitely a good point for sure. And that's why the ingredients that we choose are so important because we don't really believe in like adding additional nutrients just to, make the fiber count higher just so we can say that on the label, right? Like the
Right.
all of the fiber and the protein that we get in our products is coming from those ingredients that we're selecting kind of for other reasons. And then they just all join together to create this really high fiber product that helps to not spike your blood sugar quite so much, helps to keep you fuller for longer, and like we said, kind of give you more nutrient bang for your buck there in that
Right.
sandwich or whatever you're having for lunch or
Right.
breakfast.
And from the inside of the food manufacturing space, right? You have people that are doing things like y'all are that are like, okay, I'm going for the quality ingredients first. I'm going to make sure that these all can come together and do what we want them to do in our product. And if they can't, then we're going to find another ingredient that's still a quality ingredient that's going to be able to do that. But there are definitely, I think people need to know that like there are, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there are definitely food manufacturers out there that are just like, just figure out how to make it work.
For
And
sure.
they don't care necessarily about the nutrition. They're like you said, they're going to add stuff in there just to make their label look better,
Hmm.
but they're not necessarily taking things out that are not healthy for us just because they're there to make the product look or taste or feel, the way that they want it to. That's
Hmm.
supposedly the way consumers want it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's an interesting kind of like battle to have a little bit because like I said earlier, like taste is super important to a lot of people, and
Mhm.
having a product that has the right taste and texture is really important. But a lot of companies do that kind of at the expense of the nutrition or the quality of the product. And some people, that's what they want. They just want something that tastes good, but not necessarily something that's good for them. But
Right.
we do believe that there's that middle space, right? Like just because it's healthy doesn't mean it tastes bad, and just because it tastes good doesn't mean it can't be good for you, right?
Right.
And I feel that's especially true in the gluten-free space because a lot of people who have celiac disease or gluten sensitivity, people who can't eat gluten or wheat, are just looking for kind of that nostalgic taste. And sometimes nutrition is not the highest priority, which is understandable, but also kind of like unfortunate sometimes because people who have, especially celiac disease, the autoimmune condition where you can't have gluten in your diet because it destroys your intestines essentially.
Mhm.
Nutrition is super important for these people, especially, you know, if they've been recently diagnosed, because essentially what happens is when they've had been eating gluten, or if they get gluten like later on, it causes a disruption to their gut, flattens all those microvilli and villi that absorb all those nutrients. So nutrient deficiencies are actually super common in this group of people.
Yeah.
So if anything, these people should be they have to eat a gluten-free diet, but the more nutrients you can pack in there, the better, because absorption is sometimes non-existent. But then as the gut heals is lower at the beginning, and so these deficiencies can be really common. So
Mhm.
having it's kind of like a contradiction there, right? Where most gluten-free products are lower in nutrition, but are trying to serve a community of people who probably actually need more than what you might
Right.
say the average person. So um that is kind of the right, we feel like the right way to service this community is to make a product that obviously tastes good, because just because you can't eat gluten doesn't mean that you should have to suffer
Right.
through all these not as great tasting products, but then also to add in those extra nutrients too to help out
Right.
kind of in the healing of the gut and give prevent those nutrient deficiencies that are a lot more common.
Right. Well, and I mean, you explained that really well because one of the things that I've heard, and of course it's individualistic, right? So it's not going to be the same for everybody. But if you're gluten sensitive, not celiac obviously is a different, but there's a lot more people that are gluten sensitive
Hmm.
than have celiac. And so if you fall into that range and you have one exposure to gluten, it could affect your gut for up to 30 days or more
Hmm.
in that aspect of not being able to absorb and not be, and so you could very easily be eating a super high nutritious diet. You're just not absorbing it. And so
Hmm.
which can obviously be very frustrating because you think you're doing all these healthy things, but you're not seeing the effects. Maybe you've got brain fog, maybe you're lacking energy, and you're like, what else do I need to do when it was one simple exposure, or one, and it may not have been your fault because
Yeah,
it's hard to go to restaurants and eat,
totally.
and not be exposed to gluten if you're trying to avoid it. And so it is something that for those people, it's not, I know people that think it's just a craze or it's just a made up thing by food manufacturers to try and increase the price of food because they can put gluten free on it, they can charge more and da da da. But it's a legitimate thing that affects a lot of people.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm one of those people as well. I have severe gluten intolerance, so I'm all too familiar with this whole world, right? Where
Yeah.
it is difficult, like you said, to go out to eat or to eat at other people's homes, because having that, I think a lot of people kind of don't necessarily. It's definitely gotten better in recent years, but
Mhm.
necessarily take it as seriously as, say, an anaphylactic allergy, because
Right.
if you have a gluten sensitivity or even celiac disease, you're probably not going to end up in the hospital that night if you have trace amounts of the ingredient that you're, for lack of a better word, allergic to. But it can, as you mentioned, like it can cause long term effects that could potentially have larger impacts on your health and your wellness as well, because exposure to gluten, even in small amounts, depending on the person's sensitivity, if they don't have celiac disease, can have like a lot of consequences that just are under the surface. They're not as obvious as, someone with a peanut allergy, let's say.
Right.
But they're also important to make sure that we are, creating spaces that people can trust to make sure that they can like eat out safely and not kind of live in that fear of what's going on inside my body that I don't necessarily even know about.
Right. Well,
Mhm.
yeah, my nephew actually has celiac disease, and so it was definitely a learning curve for my sister going
Mhm.
through, and because I mean she had to change her diet when she was breastfeeding
Mhm.
because if she had gluten it would get through to him, and then she'd see all these effects, and then they finally figured out what it was. But um so I'm familiar with that side of it for
Right.
sure. And my daughter has corn allergies, so I understand that piece of it, which again, and it's her corn allergy doesn't sit her in the get her in the hospital or anaphylaxis or anything, but she'll develop a rash and just start scratching like crazy.
Right.
And so we know when she's had an exposure that's too much because we
Mhm.
can see it, and so there's sometimes when you can see it and you have that immediate, but there's other times where you may not know because it is just a small, a fragment of like, okay, just brain fog or just not feeling well or just the body because the
Mhm.
body's not getting those nutrients.
Mhm.
Is there a way to be, I mean, I know there is for celiac, but how do you find out if you're gluten sensitive, gluten intolerance? Is there a test for that? What do you need to do? What does somebody need to do?
Yeah, that's a very good question. From my experience with kind of being diagnosed with this, I was tested for celiac as a child because I was having some issues and it came back negative. But celiac is something that doesn't necessarily happen from birth, like it can
Mhm.
be triggered at a later point in your life. But the thing with the testing for celiac is the current test that we have right now, you have to be consuming a diet that has gluten in it in order to get that positive result if you do have celiac.
Mhm.
And so that's why they typically recommend to you get tested for celiac first before you make any changes to your diet because then you can't go back. And that's kind of what
Right.
happened to me was that I had been doing some research. I had gone to see a dietitian on all of this, and it was like my symptoms were very much that it was probable that I had at least a gluten sensitivity. So I cut it out and I
Right.
stopped eating gluten. And then within days really, I felt so much better. And, the first test was the first time that I got gluten, as they call it. And I
Mhm.
was like, oh, okay. So that was clearly the problem here.
Yeah.
But the issue is now I can't get tested for celiac or I won't get a positive result whether I have it or not because of
Right.
just the way the tests work. But that would definitely be my recommendation would be if that's a concern that you and your doctor or your dietitian have to get tested for celiac first. And then if that comes back negative, then there's a chance that you have what we call non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where, at the end of the day, you also need to be eating a gluten-free diet,
Mhm.
but you just don't necessarily have celiac disease, but you could still
Right.
have a gluten sensitivity. And then it's
Right.
just kind of all about seeing like how your body reacts to that. And for some people like me, it was instantly, oh, this is what the problem is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good. And it's good that those are out there, um, for people to be able to see. And it's probably something that if somebody's done a lot of other things trying to figure out, but never
Mhm.
addressed the gluten thing, um, I would imagine the test is fairly simple.
Yeah, there's a few different you can get it tested in your blood work. Sometimes they'll do like a small biopsy as well of your intestine to see if all those villi are not doing their job. But there's a few different types of tests that can be done. Some more conclusive than others, but
Mhm.
definitely something that would be worth checking out if you think that that could be a possibility or if it runs in the family as well,
Right.
because celiac disease in particular is very commonly found in many members of the same family.
Right. Um, and so gluten, and this is one of the things that also confuses people, right? You go to the store and you
Mhm.
see something that's labeled gluten-free, right? And you might initially go, well, duh, that's supposed to be gluten-free because there's no wheat in it, right? There's
Mhm.
never been wheat in this product. There should never be wheat in this product, you know? So why is it labeled gluten-free?
Mhm.
Like, is that because some companies do put wheat in stuff that we don't necessarily think is always wheat free, or is it because maybe the food manufacturers are using the same facility that are doing different products in the same, right? Like,
Mhm.
is that something that is just a blanket marketing thing, or is that like a legit, we need to make sure that people know?
Yeah, no, that's a good question for sure. Because there's definitely a lot of hidden sources of gluten in food products. So, gluten is not only just found in wheat, that's one of the more common ones, but also other grains like barley, rye, triticale, and some others like spelt as well. Gluten lives under many, many different names. So, you kind of need to know what you're looking for. So, there are times that you'd think a product would definitely be gluten free naturally, but sometimes it's not. A big one for a lot of people is different like sauces, barbecue sauces,
Mm,
soy sauce, Worcester
right.
sauce, different things like that, where you wouldn't think of that, but in the process, they sometimes use wheat or a different source of gluten. And um, so having that gluten-free certification is just kind of like further proof or confirmation for people who have a sensitivity or have celiac disease that this is a safe product for you. It is tested. I'm not exactly sure how it works in the US because we're a Canadian brand, but in Canada, as you mentioned, our facility that we bake all of our products in is certified gluten free. So, if we were to make any products for any other companies that were also a gluten free product in our facility, it already has the certifications. So, whether they feel they need it or not, they can add it to their products. So there's also that factor to it as well. But I think the more clear we can be with things like that, with these certifications and the transparency of ingredients, the better, because whether you are gluten free or have any other kind of allergy, it's just helpful to know as clearly as possible that this food is safe for me, or honestly, a lot of people who are shopping for someone in their life who has celiac disease, like a friend or a family member, just having those different certification symbols can be really helpful because, like I mentioned, all those different potential sources of gluten, a lot of people know to look out for wheat, but might not know that barley has gluten in it and all these other things, right? So the certifications definitely make that more clear for those with celiac disease or gluten sensitivities and all of their family and friends too.
We've got the quality ingredients, we've got the understanding of like what makes something gluten free, what makes something not gluten free. Um, we when we see new products on the shelf, when we see new companies that we haven't heard from that are entering the space, or maybe it's a company we do know that's introducing a new product that is gluten
Mhm.
free. Maybe they haven't done that before. Like, how do we know that this is what we were looking for, and it's not just a marketing ploy, it's not just smoke and mirrors, that this is like, okay, this is legitimately something that's going to be beneficial to me versus somebody who's trying to, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, like take advantage of the space and make money.
Yeah, good question for sure. I would say that the clearest way to be confident that something is gluten free, if that's something that you're looking for, is these different gluten free certifications that you can have. It'll look like a little symbol, and you could look up a picture of it
Mhm.
online and find these different certification websites. Because essentially, what all of these different certification programs do is they validate and make sure that the all the ingredients sourced are gluten free that go into this product, and that the facility itself is gluten free
Right.
and you can trust it, right?
Right.
So certifications are kind of that like verification check that, don't worry, we looked into it. By like a third party comes and
Mhm.
looks into it and they say you're good to go. This is safe. And then a another thing to look for if say you don't see that, because one thing about certifications is they are something that the company has to pay to get.
Sure.
So sometimes smaller companies, especially if it's like a new product, may not have gone through that whole process yet because it can also take some time, or they don't have the budget to do that yet.
Mhm.
So they may just have like what we would call a claim instead of a certification that says this is gluten free. Now, that is something that the company can add themselves and it's not regulated in the same way. So
Sure.
that can be like a little bit more tricky, but there are sometimes valid reasons why companies just have relying on the claim instead of the certification to start. But that's where you can take a look at those ingredients to see kind of like what your quote unquote risk might be, right? So you
Right.
can look at the ingredients and look out for any of those things I mentioned earlier, like the wheat, barley, rye, triticale, all that, to see if there is gluten in the product or also in that contains or may contain line at the end of the ingredients. So contains obviously would mean that it has that ingredient in it. Like if it
Right.
says contains nuts or contains wheat, you'd know
Yeah.
that is a no-go. But may contain generally means that there are those ingredients in the same facility. They may not be in the product itself, but there technically is a risk of cross-contamination because they are in that same facility.
Right.
Or maybe they share a manufacturing line with an ingredient, one of those ingredients. So there's that as well. And another thing you can do if you're not sure is on packaging, there's usually some way to contact the company, whether it be a
Mhm.
phone number or email, or you can look up their website and
Yeah.
you can ask you can ask these companies a little bit more about it. Say they have a may contain statement, but you could ask them, is this product produced on a shared line? What steps are in
Right.
place to prevent that cross contamination? And you can just like ask these different companies if this is a to kind of do your own investigation. But obviously, the easiest thing is if it has that gluten free certification, then you're good to go. Our products are gluten free certified as well as vegan, non GMO, and newly certified kosher as well. So,
Oh, cool.
that kind of we're trying to make sure that everybody knows as easily as they can that this
Yeah.
product is safe for them, regardless kind of their diet, because we are free from the top 10 allergens. So, um,
Nice.
kind of, we want it to be bred for everybody.
Right. Right. And so for the companies that are doing it like you, as far as third party tested and all of that stuff, and getting the certification, like how often is that certification need to be like renewed, or are they checking the products to make sure that like, okay, yes, they, the places we source the ingredients didn't, change the way they're doing things, because like we said earlier, the costs can rise and fluctuate,
Mhm.
and so is it just you know, like, hey, we got the first sample through, now we can change it. Like,
Right.
right? Like,
Yeah.
how's that?
Um, yeah, that's a very good question for sure. I'm not necessarily positive about the exact number of days or anything, but
Mhm.
I know that you do have to submit samples every so often to be
Gotcha.
tested. And anytime you are trying to like introduce a new ingredient or getting a new supplier, it has to meet these compliance factors as well. That if your supplier that you use for chia seed flour, for example, doesn't have enough and you need to order from somebody else too, they would have
Mhm.
to meet these certain criteria as well in
Right.
order to keep that. And it's definitely something that we take super seriously as well because, as we talked about earlier, whether it's an anaphylactic allergy or something that doesn't necessarily cause that, but can have serious consequences as well, that's something that we would never like mess around with.
Right.
Because it's serious and important to make sure that you're being as honest and transparent with your customers as possible for sure.
Right. Well, and yeah, because like we said, I would think it'd be very rare that a gluten exposure would lead to a, hospitalization immediately,
Hmm.
but it can definitely lead to not feeling well,
Yeah, problems down
whether
the
you have
line for
celiac
sure.
disease or not. And so, yeah, just a little bit of exposure, especially when you think that it's not, because if you think that you're eating gluten free and you're supposed to be and you're starting to feel bad, you know, you don't want to have to do all the research into, are these companies really do gluten free? You want to be able to go, okay, well, something else is going on. What else is going on? And
Right.
be solid in that versus going like, oh, I just happen to be eating something that's quote gluten free, but it's not anymore.
Right, exactly. And that's another good point that you mentioned as well is for anybody who has a gluten allergy of any kind or sensitivity or celiac disease would be to we all have our like safe products,
Mhm.
but would always be to every time you shop, just always double check because especially brands that are not kind of gluten free by name or nature, right?
Mhm.
Like we will always be.
Right.
That's never going to change. But there are some, of these larger corporations that may have a product that is gluten free, but then there might be an ingredient change and it doesn't really need to be announced as long as the packaging is appropriate.
Yeah.
So it's always something that especially if it's not kind of your safe go-to gluten-free product to always just like double check every time you're in the store because sometimes you never know if something has been changed and the last thing you want to do is um, cause a glutening by yourself, like by something that you
Right.
purchased yourself, not
Right.
by an accident of a restaurant or something like that.
Right. Well, and that's a legitimate concern for there've been two companies recently, I mean, in the last year to year and a half that staked their business and their reputation on building the mom and pop, if you will, product in super healthy, not necessarily gluten free, but the super healthy side of things. They sold to a bigger company who
Hmm.
manufactures a ton of stuff, and the bigger company went, well, we can make this cheaper by this, and this change, and then it no longer matches what the original was as far as the health perspective. But if
Hmm.
you don't know that that happens and you just go, nope, this is the product that I buy, I'm just going to keep doing it. It still looks the same on the
Right.
packaging, but the label, the ingredients are different. And
Hmm.
if you don't pay attention, you may not know. And they're not always those things are not always mainstream news, like,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you may not know it's happening until you have that unhealthy reaction to it,
Right.
you know,
Hmm.
and nobody wants that.
Absolutely not.
So So tell us how can we get Queen Street Bakery? How can we follow along with what you're doing? And are there new products on the forefront that y'all are looking at?
Yeah, good question for sure. So, we are available all across Canada and the US. In the US, we just launched recently in Sprouts,
Ooh,
which
cool.
has been really great, and we're in Whole Foods as well. One thing about us is you can find us in the frozen section of your grocery store if there's a health food aisle or maybe just the breakfast section, but we're in the freezer. Reason being that we don't use any preservatives in our products because we like to just keep it with only what we need, nothing that we don't need.
Mhm.
And so we live in the freezer because the freezer is a natural preservative. So that's where you can
Right.
find us. And then we're also available online for ordering. We just launched days ago a build your own box option. So you can kind of pick exactly what you want to order,
Okay.
which is exciting. And yeah, so those are kind of the main places to find us. We're also in a lot of other like smaller stores around the country, but
Mhm.
Sprouts and Whole Foods are going to be your best bet there.
Okay.
We just launched a few months ago our newest product, which is our sourdough bread. It's called our super grain sourdough bread. So it's made from a slow fermented sorghum based sourdough. Sorghum is a gluten free, obviously. Ancient grain that's packed full of nutrition. So we
Uh-huh.
just make our sourdough starter out of sorghum flour instead of wheat flour. And that product is really delicious. As we talked about earlier, it really has that kind of nostalgic taste and texture
Right.
for like your sandwich or whatever
Yeah.
you reminds you of childhood. But it also has that taste that your inner child loves, but that nutrition that your adult version of yourself loves as well. It's really high in fiber, all the great gut benefits of the sourdough,
Yeah.
because the sourdough is actually the second ingredient after water in the product. So there's a lot of it in there, which
Yeah.
is great for your gut health. And that's my personal new favorite product
Yeah.
for sure. So we've got that, and we have a few other breads. We're pretty well known for our bagels. So we have a chia and flaxseed bagel, and everything bagel, and a cinnamon raisin. And then we have English muffins that are award winning as well. So
Nice.
you've got all the different breakfast and
Yeah.
bread products to choose from. And we're always working on more places that you can find us, and more products. So follow along on Instagram. We're at Queen Street Bakery, all spelled out. Or also join our email newsletter on our website as well, where we share updates there too. So you'll be the
Awesome.
first to know when a new store launches, or a new product as
Right.
well.
Awesome. Well, and I will say, as a vegan who tries to be gluten-free, I I don't have a reason to necessarily from a health standpoint other than just choosing to. So I know there's times where I avoid, where I fall off of that track, but I've been vegan for, my kids asked me this the other day, for almost 10 years.
Mhm.
And so trying to find bagels that fit into all of that aren't cardboard is
Yeah.
really that's really hard. Um,
Totally.
and because yeah, they're like I've brought home a couple different brands before, and my wife has been like, "Yeah, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
I'm not touching that."
Which is always a shame, right? When that
Yeah,
happens. So for
yeah.
sure.
So, well, Alicia, I want to thank you so much for being a guest. It's been great having you on and learning about what y'all are doing, but also the reasons behind it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for checking out the Confidence Through Health podcast. Please subscribe, post a review, share this episode with those you love who need a little extra help with their health journey. Visit allinhealthandwellness.com to learn more about the coaching programs that I provide. All episodes are produced by the Social Media Cowboys, your source for all online marketing needs. Go to socialmediacowboys.com for more information.